Welcome to PandaAudioBooks, the perfect place for a huge collection of fantasy novels. If you enjoy my content and want to support my work, a small contribution via PayPal is greatly appreciated. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the notifications bell to stay updated with our latest audiobook chapters. Chapter 1346, Probe. The half-page contained the refinement methods for the high zenith invisibility talisman that Han Li had once used, the 9 palaces heavenly talisman that had inspired the creation of the myriad dragon beads, and a puppet talisman known as the armor origin talisman. There was also a 4th and final talisman known as the heavenly halberd talisman, and it was the only one on the half-page that possessed offensive properties. Following his experimentation with the high zenith invisibility talisman, Han Li had already roughly mastered the refinement method. Even though the success rate was extremely low, as long as he was willing to splurge on materials, he would still be able to successfully refine it. The 9 palaces heavenly talismans was an immortal talisman used to trap enemies. Even though he had only gleaned half of its refinement method, that had still been enough for him to invent the myriad dragon bead. As for the final 2 types of talismans, Han Li was completely clueless about them. However, as Han Li was searching for ready-made shadow puppet talismans in the marketplace of Deep Heaven City, he coincidentally discovered a key point about the armor origin talisman. With his extensive knowledge in the field of puppetry, it was quite likely that he would be able to make some progress given more thorough research in the future. As for the final heavenly halberd talisman, that was a metal attribute offensive talisman. According to the information on the half-page of the Golden Jade Tome, activating the talisman would allow one to manifest a heavenly halberd from the true immortal realm, which possessed the power to split the earth and part oceans. However, this talisman was extremely profound and Han Li was simply unable to comprehend it at his current deity transformation stage cultivation base. Han Li stroked the jade badge as he contemplated the situation. There were countless high-grade cultivators in Deep Heaven City, many of which were more powerful than him. As such, it is naturally best to create as many trump cards for himself in order to ensure his survival. Unfortunately, he was unable to refine 3 of the 4 aforementioned talismans. However, even with just the high zenith invisibility talisman, he could already conceal himself even from spatial tempering cultivators. If he could refine a couple of those, then they would definitely prove to be very useful. As for the other talismans, Han Li wasn't in a hurry to refine them. He would simply have to conduct further research on them in the future. With that in mind, Han Li flicked his wrist and brilliant azure light erupted from his storage bracelet. The azure light swept down toward the ground before receding to reveal a series of brocade and jade boxes of different sizes, as well as some vials and gourds. Han Li made a grabbing motion toward the ground, upon which a brocade box immediately flew toward him. He removed the lid of the box to reveal a section of red hide from an unknown beast. However, the spiritual light shimmering over its surface suggested that it belonged to no ordinary demon beast. Han Li immediately tossed the small section of beast hide into the air before opening his mouth. A spluttering sound rang out, following which a ball of azure spiritual light completely enveloped the beast hide. Han Li made a hand seal, and the color of the spiritual light instant changed drastically, transforming into furious crimson flames. A peculiar scene unfolded. Not only was the beast hide not burned to a crisp by the crimson flames, the spiritual light emanating from it became even more dazzling instead while its surface gradually became translucent. At this moment, Han Li pointed a finger at several other jade vials. Those vials immediately opened of their own accord, and powder of different colors emerged from within before disappearing into the flames in a flash. A series of crackles and pops rang out as the powders transformed into spiritual light of different colors that injected themselves into the beast hide. The surface of the transparent beast hide was immediately illuminated with exuberant light. Han Li continued to make hand seals, but his eyes were already closed. Aside from the crackles and pops erupting from the crimson flames, no other sound could be heard within the secret chambers. 2 months passed by in a flash. During this time, a resounding boom would erupt within the secret chamber every few days. Only after a dozen or so of these cycles did the secret chamber fall completely silent. Another half a month later, the doors of the secret chamber were opened. Han Li emerged from within with furrowed brows before immediately rushing toward the hall. There was still faint spiritual light shimmering there, and the silver screen of light, as well as the 4 specks of light on it, had become quite blurry and indistinct. Han Li immediately replaced the high-grade spirit stones around the formation with new ones before activating it again. Piercing silver light abruptly radiated from the octagonal formation plate, and everything on the silver light screen became clearly visible again. Han Li cast his gaze toward the specks of light with a dark expression. The 4 specks of light that had split up earlier had gathered together once again, and they were only around 200 kilometers away from his cave. There were 2 reasons behind Han Li's decision to emerge from the secret chamber. Firstly, he had finally managed to successfully refine a high zenith invisibility talisman, and secondly, one of the gold-devouring beetles he deployed to keep an eye on these people had disappeared. Han Li didn't know whether it had been trapped or killed. Prior to this, Han Li's second nascent soul, which had been responsible for refining spirit medicines in the cave abode, had informed Han Li that these specks of light had been at that very same location for several days already. Could it be that they had already found what they were looking for? With that in mind, Han Li suddenly sat down in front of the light screen with his legs crossed, appraising the screen in silence. 3 days passed, yet those specks of light still showed no signs of moving. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, Han Li heaved a faint sigh and rose to his feet. It appeared that he would have to make a trip there no matter what. Regardless of what intentions these people had, if they were to stir up some trouble in his plot of Spirit Land, he would potentially have to suffer the consequences. After all, a distance of several hundred kilometers could be covered in virtually the blink of an eye for cultivators like them. These people were lurking so close to him. How was he supposed to focus on cultivation with that knowledge? As such, it was best for him to inspect the scene in person. Of course, if they had discovered something of value, then he wouldn't mind trying to take it from them. Han Li had faced spatial tempering cultivators in the past, and he was confident in his ability to escape from them even if he couldn't win in a battle. In particular, he had just refined his lightning robes, lightning beads, and a high zenith invisibility talisman, so he was feeling even more assured. Meanwhile, those 4 people were completely oblivious to the fact that they were under surveillance from the myriad dragon beads, and there was no way that there would be any body integration cultivators among them. With that in mind, Han Li rose into the air as a streak of azure light and departed from his cave abode. After exiting the cave abode, Han Li began to chant something, following which he slowly turned completely transparent. This concealment technique wasn't as effective as the high zenith invisibility talisman, but it was also very difficult for anyone to see through it unless they were to carefully inspect Han Li with their spiritual sense. Hence, it was more than enough to ensure that he avoided detection. In the next instant, Han Li flew toward the location stipulated on the light screen. It was only several hundred kilometers away, and at Han Li's current speed, it wouldn't take him long to get there at all. However, he intentionally slowed down in order to ensure stealth as his top priority. Even so, he still got there after only a short journey. As the target drew closer, Han Li silently descended toward the ground. The spiritual light around him then turned yellow as he continued to advance by burrowing into the ground and using his earth movement technique. In the process, Han Li was making hand seals to obscure his aura to perfection. After descending into the ground for close to 10 kilometers, Han Li suddenly stopped, and his eyes narrowed as he said something in a soundless manner. Specks of golden light abruptly flashed within the soil around him as several gold-devouring beetles emerged before disappearing up his sleeve. The wisps of spiritual sense that had been infused into the bodies of the beetles were withdrawn, following which a peculiar look appeared on Han Li's face. So they really are looking for something, but I didn't think that what they're looking for would be in that place. Seeing as these people were able to detect my gold-devouring beetles and kill one of them, there has to be at least one spatial tempering stage being among them, Han Li murmured to himself as he lowered his head in deep thought. All of a sudden, he swept his hand over his storage bracelet and spiritual light flashed as a purple talisman appeared in his grasp. The talisman was shimmering with bright light. There were countless silver runes flashing all over it. This was none other than the high zenith invisibility talisman he'd recently refined. Due to the improvements in materials and refinement methods used, this talisman was far more powerful than the last one. Han Li wasn't confident in his ability to approach any further without being detected by spatial tempering cultivators. As such, even he was rather reluctant to use this talisman, he still decided to do so anyway. He had to ensure that he would continue to remain undetected. The talisman was quite valuable, but it naturally couldn't compare with his life. Furthermore, due to the fact that the high zenith invisibility talisman had been perfected on this occasion, it was no longer a disposable tool. Instead, it could be reused until the power imbued within it ran out. The purple talisman exploded and several shimmering beveled silver text runes appeared before dancing around Han Li. Han Li cast a few incantation seals with a serious expression on his face. The runes around him then transformed into clouds of silver mist that enshrouded him in the blink of an eye. The silver mist dissipated moments later, and Han Li had completely disappeared. As soon as he vanished on the spot, Han Li sensed the difference between this high zenith invisibility talisman and the last one. At this moment, he could even draw upon all of his treasures as well as a vast amount of his spiritual power. Of course, he was capable of using those resources, but if he were to unleash a treasure or a technique that was too powerful, then the invisibility effect of the talisman would be dispelled. Even so, Han Li was already very pleased. At the very least, he would be able to seize the initiative and launch the first wave of attacks should he choose to do so. As such, he immediately continued on toward his destination. After flying for several more kilometers, Han Li's body began to slowly drift upward. Chapter 1347 – Strange Space. When Han Li appeared soundlessly on the surface of the ground again, he looked around to find that he was situated halfway up a bleak and barren rocky mountain. It was quite strange that such a barren land could exist here, considering this plot of land was sitting atop a spirit vein. Back when Han Li was surveying the entirety of his plot of spirit land, he had identified this as a rather strange place and searched through the nearby area. However, he didn't discover anything at the time and he was in a hurry to construct his cave abode, so he quickly departed, concluding that this mountain merely had sparse spiritual qi due to some natural causes. Even though such occurrences were extremely rare for plots of land sitting atop spirit veins, there were still some precedents. However, Han Li was naturally still rather skeptical about this place and was planning to return for a closer examination when he had some free time. Now, these four people had lingered nearby for several days already, so there was definitely something amiss about this mountain. Han Li furrowed his brows as he digested the information transferred back to him by the several wisps of spiritual sense. He then swayed and drifted up toward the mountain summit. His current body was as light as air and virtually insubstantial, and he soon reached the mountain summit before hovering in the air in a completely still manner. He cast his gaze downward to find that it was still just a rocky mountain down below. It seemed to be completely identical to how it was the last time he'd been here. Han Li raised an eyebrow as he swept his spiritual sense downward, but didn't discover anything through doing that, either. Following a brief period of contemplation, he suddenly made a hand seal and injected his magic power into his eyes in the frenzy. All of a sudden, piercing blue light flashed deep within Han Li's pupils as he activated his bright sight spirit eyes to their maximal extent. All things that were normally invisible to the naked eye were revealed to Han Li. This time, he managed to quickly discover something. There were 8 faint pillars of light rising up from the ground around the mountain, creating a strange rectangular formation that enshrouded the entire mountain summit. Han Li didn't know what kind of peculiar treasures had manifested their pillars of light, but not only was the formation created completely invisible and colorless, it wasn't even giving off any spiritual qi fluctuations. It was no wonder that he was unable to discover the formation even with his formidable spiritual sense. It appeared that this temporary restriction had to have been set up by those 4 people. If it weren't for the fact that Han Li had been constantly monitoring their locations, it actually would have been very unlikely that he would have tracked them down here and seen through this restriction. However, although this restriction was extremely obscure, its main ability was concealment and it didn't really pose much of an obstacle. With Han Li's current mastery of formation spells, he was quickly able to make an assessment of this formation before making a hand seal and descending into the formation in a fearless manner. An incredible scene ensued. After coming into contact with Han Li's insubstantial body, the invisible formation displayed no reaction whatsoever. He was able to easily pass through the restriction, then completely disappear into the mountain summit. It was quite clear that Han Li's current body, after using the invisibility talisman, was able to simply disregard normal restrictions. Han Li burrowed into the earth for over 200 feet, following which a blue ball of light appeared beneath him. It was only a head-sized ball of light, but there seemed to be a vortex swirling within it. Han Li was quite intrigued to see this, and he slowly approached it to get a better look. Much to Han Li's surprise, as soon as he began to draw closer, the vortex within the blue ball of light seemed to have detected his presence. It immediately blasted forth a burst of brilliant 7-colored light, following which Han Li was swept into the vortex in flash. Han Li was caught completely off guard and given quite a shock. After a brief struggle, he discovered that he was unable to escape the enormous power that had appeared around him. Before he had a chance to try and unleash any treasures or powerful techniques, his surroundings blurred, and he appeared in a completely unfamiliar place as if through instantaneous teleportation. At the same time, his insubstantial body regained substance, revealing himself to the naked eye once again. At the same time, purple light flashed on his chest as a purple talisman appeared out of thin air. Han Li immediately grabbed the talisman before bringing his hands together, and following a flash of spiritual light, the high zenith invisibility talisman disappeared. There was no point in reactivating it as there were 2 people standing nearby, and they'd already discovered him. These 2 were also given a fright by Han Li's sudden and unannounced arrival. After catching sight of Han Li's facial features, one of them yelled, "How did you find this place?" That man was none other than the cultivator with the Wang surname. His companion was the Fatso with the Jin surname, and he also wore a bewildered look on his face. In reality, if it weren't for the fact that the high zenith invisibility talisman had made Han Li's body insubstantial, even with his complete mastery of the Vajra arts, being swept up in that 7-colored light would have caused him to throw up a few mouthfuls of blood essence. Of course, that was all unbeknownst to him. This 7-colored light appeared to be rather similar to Buddhist spiritual light, but it actually had far different origins. If a normal cultivator were to be swept up in it, not only would they be completely unable to use their magic power, they would be crushed into mincemeat by the immense pressure. In order to nullify this restriction and forcibly enter this place, the 2 men and their masters had worked tirelessly for 3 days and 3 nights. Only were they able to force their way into this space using their magic power and treasures. Han Li was quite relieved to see these 2. Seeing as there were no spatial tempering cultivators present, he'd be able to take care of these 2 with ease. Even though his concealment technique had abruptly been broken, he merely laughed it off, and said, "I was wondering who had set up the restriction outside. Turns out it was you 2. Do you have any business here, fellow Taoists?" If I recall correctly, one of the laws of Deep Heaven City states that outsiders are prohibited from trespassing on the spirit land of others. If you need to visit the plot of spirit land for some reason, you have to notify the owner in advance and receive approval. Otherwise, if this were to be reported to the heavenly guards, the trespassers will be punished by torture using the poisonous whip. Han Li's voice gradually grew colder as he spoke. Even though both of these intruders were deity transformation cultivators, they still winced slightly at the mention of the poisonous whip. However, the Fatso quickly put on a smile, and said, "Please don't misunderstand, fellow Daoist Han. Brother Wang and I just so happened to be passing through this place, and we were resting on the summit of this mountain when we somehow activated this restriction and were teleported here. We're also quite confused by this situation as well." "Oh, do you think I'll believe that, Brother Jin? By the way, if I'm not mistaken, there are 2 more fellow Taoists here, right?" Han Li clasped his hands behind his back with a fake smile on his face. At this point, he had already assessed his surroundings with his spiritual sense. Through doing so, he discovered that he was situated in a mysterious space. This space was over 1,000 feet tall and around half a kilometer in radius, so it wasn't very large at all. However, there was 7-colored light hovering in the sky above and swirling throughout their surroundings. What was even more surprising was that high up in the air within this space, there were 7 massive balls of light that resembled suns. However, the white light they were radiating had a cooling effect instead. There was a 7-colored door of light situated at the center of each of the balls of light. Within was a series of completely murky and indistinct scenes. Both of the intruders were already shocked to hear Han Li's words, and their expressions immediately darkened as they caught sight of Han Li glancing toward the 7 doors of light. How many of us were in here?" The fatso's voice immediately turned extremely cold.
Oh, are you trying to pick a fight?
I forgot to tell you this, but before coming here, I already left behind a few voice transmission talismans and set up some restrictions. If something were to happen to me down here, those voice transmission talismans would be sent out to Senior Jiao Wugui as well a few friends that I recently made. Trespassing on one's spirit land without any good reason nor permission, then attacking the owner of the spirit land, also for no justifiable reason. I'm sure the enforcement squads would be interested to hear this. Those two crimes lumped together would probably earn you more than just punishment by whipping. Besides, do you two really think you have what it takes to kill me, even if you join forces?
Han Li asked with a disdainful, "You know Heavenly Guard Jiao."
The man with the Wang surname was rather skeptical to hear this. His fatso companion also faltered upon hearing this. Senior Jiao was the one who led me to Deep Heaven City in person.
Do you think I know him or not?
Han Li replied in a calm manner. Han Li's calm and collected expression immediately made the two intruders feel less confident. HMPH, seeing as you already know that there are more of us here, then I'll tell you what you want to know. Aside from the two of us, our masters are also here, and they've entered the deeper restrictions.
What are you going to do?
You're just a deity transformation cultivator. Are you going to try and stop them? The laws of Deep Heaven City only apply under certain circumstances. Do you think anyone will risk offending two spatial tempering cultivators just to avenge a dead deity transformation cultivator? Even if you know Senior Jiao Wugui, you're probably just an acquaintance of his. The man with the Wang surname scoffed after a brief silence.
Oh, really?
How about we make a bet, then, fellow Daoist Wang? However, prior to coming here, I anticipated that you'd be the one behind all this, so I intentionally mentioned your name in my voice transmission talismans. But then again, with your powerful cultivation base, I'm sure you won't fear the enforcement squad's soul search techniques, right?
Han Li chucked.
If these people really weren't afraid of the heavenly guards of Deep Heaven City, then why would they go to so much effort to sneak into his spirit land without being detected? As soon as Han Li said this, the man with the Wang surname became extremely tense. The fatso was also a little dumbfounded. If the man with the Wen surname were to be captured and have his soul searched, the fatso would definitely be detained as well as an accomplice. If this incident were to be revealed to the heavenly guards and the panel of elders, they would be in severe trouble. I've always heard that fellow Daoist Han's abilities are quite extraordinary. You possess a bright future ahead of you. Surely you wouldn't want to risk your life to apprehend us here. In all honesty, Brother Wang and I aren't the masterminds behind all this. If you have conditions, how about you raise them when our seniors return? The fatso asked in a sly manner. Are you banking on the fact that I wouldn't dare to stay here? All right then, I wanted to meet your seniors anyway, so I'll be happy to wait here for them, Han Li said with a calm smile. His body swayed and he appeared in a corner in the blink of an eye before sitting down with his legs crossed. He really did appear to be intent on waiting for the two spatial tempering cultivators. Chapter 1348. Jade Bone Humanoid Devil. The two intruders were naturally quite surprised to see this. The two of them communicate silently through voice transmission before also sitting down in another corner with their legs crossed. Their thought process was quite simple. They weren't confident in their ability to kill Han Li, and Han Li himself didn't seem to have any intention of entering the seven-colored doors of light. As such, they would simply have to play the waiting game and leave all of the troublesome matters for their seniors to take care of. As such, the entire space became extremely quiet. All three were meditating with their eyes closed or appraising the doors of light. Unbeknownst to the two intruders, Han Li was actually feeling quite nervous. The voice transmission talismans and restrictions he'd mentioned earlier naturally didn't exist. His original plan was that if these people could obtain the treasures in here, he'd be able to sneak up on them and take those treasures using his high zenith invisibility talisman. If there were some cultivators that were too powerful for him to deal with, then he'd simply have to survey them from the shadows. However, what was completely unexpected to him was that the strange seven-colored light had forced him into this space and even broken the concealment effect of his talisman. As such, he had no choice but to directly face these cultivators. Thankfully, he had thought of several strategies that would make these people wary of him, and he was currently using one of them to intimidate these two intruders. Of course, that wasn't because Han Li was fearful of these two. The man with the Wang surname and the Fatso were at the mid-deity transformation stage and late deity transformation stage respectively, but with his current set of abilities and treasures, there was at least an 80% chance that he'd be able to kill them on the spot. Killing these two would be quite simple, but the consequences would be rather troublesome to deal with, as he'd be forging a vendetta with the two spatial tempering cultivators who had entered the doors of light. Even though he didn't want to spare these trespassers, he also didn't want to make a pair of such powerful enemies. Furthermore, even if he could kill these two intruders with ease, there was a chance that he wouldn't be able to escape from this mysterious place in a short time. In that case, once the spatial tempering cultivators emerged, he would be the next one to be killed. As such, it was better for him to try and find a way out first. Once he could formulate a path for retreat, he'd have a lot more options. With that in mind, Han Li sprang into action. Even though his eyes were closed, he had split his powerful spiritual sense up into countless tendrils that shot forth in all directions. Han Li was spreading his spiritual sense without any attempt to mask what he was doing, so the two intruders had naturally sensed his actions. However, neither of them said anything to stop him. Instead, they were sneering internally. As soon as a wisp of Han Li's spiritual sense came into contact with the seven-colored light on one of the walls, it was immediately sucked in and disappeared. Furthermore, a burst of powerful suction force erupted, threatening to suck away the rest of Han Li's spiritual sense directly out of his body. Han Li was stunned by this turn of events and hurriedly activated his great development technique to dispel this suction force. However, Han Li also opened his eyes as a result, and he was staring at the light swirling on the wall with a hint of bewilderment on his face. He naturally also noticed the gloating smiles on the faces of the intruders. It appeared that these two were aware of the peculiar nature of the seven-colored light in here, and they intentionally refrained from informing him of this information. Han Li was a little angry, but his expression remained unchanged as he continued to try and formulate a plan. It was a pity that the spatial spirit treasure that he'd refined, the Crimson Soul Flag, was destroyed by the spatial storms within the spatial node. Otherwise, it would most likely have been quite useful for breaking through this spatial barrier. Of course, aside from his Crimson Soul Flag, his Law Destruction Eye was also quite effective in tearing through space. However, this place was quite mysterious, and it was yet to be seen whether his Law Destruction Eye would be able to break through the barrier here in a short time, or even at all. Countless thoughts were flashing through Han Li's mind, and he quickly decided on another course of action. Seeing as his spiritual sense couldn't infiltrate the walls here, then he could use his bright sight spirit eyes to try and identify some avenues for escape. Thus, he immediately poured his spiritual power into his eyes, and brilliant blue light appeared deep within his pupils. A day and a night passed by. Han Li had already closed his eyes again and seemed to have gone into deep meditation. His prior detection hadn't allowed him to discover a good way to escape. Meanwhile, the seven doors of light in the air above remained completely silent and still. The two intruders were staring intently up at the sky with dark expressions. Of course, they were also casting the occasional wary glance in Han Li's direction. Your two seniors still haven't come out after such a long time. Could it be that they've encountered some difficulties in there? Han Li suddenly asked with his eyes closed. Rest assured, fellow Daoist Han, if something had happened to our masters, we would have been informed already. Are you getting impatient, Brother Han? The man with the Wang surname asked. I'm glad to hear that your two seniors are fine. I have sufficient patience to. Before Han Li had a chance to finish his sentence, a ringing sound abruptly erupted from the seven balls of light in the air. Immediately thereafter, they began to emanate astonishing spiritual pressure as well as scintillating light. Not only were the two intruders given a massive surprise, Han Li also opened his eyes to assess this turn of events. However, this was only the beginning. As the ringing sound intensified, the seven balls of light swelled drastically, expanding to the size of wagon wheels in the blink of an eye while flashing erratically. Rippling spatial fluctuations abruptly appeared around the seven balls of light before flashing over the door of light at the very center. All of a sudden, it was as if an enormous burst of invisible power had begun compressing the door, making it twist and warp violently. The Fatso immediately rose to his feet upon seeing this, and exclaimed, "This is bad, His companion also wore a stunned expression. Han Li was also rather disgruntled by this turn of events. Not only were the balls of light in the sky becoming quite unstable and erratic, even the walls and ground were beginning to tremor gently while the seven-colored light was displaying signs of crumbling. These were clearly strong indications that this space was on the verge of collapse. Seeing as his life was under threat, Han Li immediately rose to his feet and laid a hand on his head, following which a burst of gray light began to emerge from the back of his head. He then flipped a hand over, and golden light flashed as 3 shimmering golden beads were summoned. These were none other than the 3 lightning beads he'd refined not long ago. At this moment, the 2 intruders had also summoned several treasures. However, they had no confidence in their ability to escape from this mysterious place, and both of them wore horrified expressions. Han Li naturally wasn't going to pay any heed to whether they lived or died. He immediately decided to use his Law Destruction Eye in conjunction with his Divine Essence-fused light and these lightning beads to break through this space in order to facilitate an escape. However, right at this moment, a massive rumbling boom erupted from within the doors of light up above. Han Li was startled by this loud commotion and reflexively stopped what he was doing. 7-colored light flashed and a streak of green light, as well as a streak of golden light, shot forth from within the door in the very center. The 2 streaks of light flashed through the air before receding to reveal a tiny green WM and a miniature humanoid figure. The green WM was missing one of its horns as well as many of its scales. Meanwhile, the miniature humanoid figure's hair was quite disheveled, and it was missing a large chunk of its golden robes. Both of them appeared to be running for their lives. "We have to get out of here. This isn't the place where Master Thousand Treasure passed away. It's a place where a jade-bone humanoid devil has been sealed. We've triggered a restriction set up any an ancient cultivator, and the devil has been freed. This space is also going to immediately collapse as a result, so... Who are you?" The miniature humanoid figure's urgent voice abruptly cut off as he caught sight of Han Li. The fatso was ecstatic to see their 2 seniors re-emerge, and his lips tremored as he informed the 2 of Han Li's identity through voice transmission. "Grandpa, he's that Han brat, he. So he's the owner of this plot of spirit land." A hint of killing intent flashed through the eyes of the green WM upon hearing this. "What are you doing, Brother Ming? Our top priority is to run for our lives now, not be caught up by such trivial matters. It would be far too heavy a price to pay for both of us if our avatars were to fall here. Besides, don't forget that he's an ascended cultivator. I have no interest in forging a vendetta with those madmen," the miniature humanoid figure hurried urged. "All right, let's get out of this place, then. As long as we don't kill him in person, even if Zhao Wugui and the others come to find us, they won't be able to do anything. Once this space collapses, that Han brat can perish along with that jade-bone humanoid devil. It's a pity that only my avatar is here. Otherwise, I wouldn't have to fear this devil. Let's go." The green WM only hesitated momentarily before curbing its killing intent and making a wise decision. "We have to make haste. This space is going to hold up for much longer." The miniature humanoid figure was quite relieved that the green WM was open to seeing reason. After all, it would be a massive waste if this soul avatar were to perish here. As such, it immediately began to make hand seals while chanting something. The wooden sword strapped to its back tremored before abruptly rising into the air, transforming into a massive sword of light that was around 10 feet in length. The green WM also let loose a loud roar as it transformed into a massive green WM over 100 feet in length amid bursts of wind and lightning. There was a single twisted green horn on its head, and the purple lightning flashing over its body made for a formidable spectacle to behold. Han Li didn't know what these people had just discussed, but his heart jolted slightly at the sight of the powerful abilities unleashed by these 2 spatial tempering cultivators. At this point, the 7-colored light swirling along the surrounding walls had completely disappeared. The walls were beginning to tremor violently and had been warped to the extreme. Chapter 1349, Spatial Storm. The massive WM's body shuddered as it whipped its tail and opened its mouth to blast forth a pillar of azure light. An arc of purple lightning that was around the same thickness as a large bowl also erupted from its remaining horn. The two then combined as one before hurtling directly toward a nearby wall. At the same time, the miniature humanoid figure laid a hand on the top of its head, and a pillar of golden light immediately erupted into the air, disappearing into the giant sword above its head. A ringing sound erupted from the sword, and not only did it further expand to around twice its size in the blink of an eye, it also began to emanate piercing golden light that was scintillating as the sun. Meanwhile, the miniature humanoid figure shrank even further after unleashing that pillar of light. However, it completely disregarded the changes taking place to its own body as it made a hand seal. The massive sword flew forth as a streak of golden light in hot pursuit behind the azure pillar of light. Both attacks were targeting the same spot on the wall. A resounding boom erupted as azure and golden light exploded and intertwined with one another, forming a gargantuan ball of light that was several tens of feet in size with countless bolts of purple lightning shimmering over its surface. The ball of light was able to slowly sink into the wall at the behest of the two spatial tempering cultivators, and it appeared to be unstoppable as it threatened to forcibly tear open the spatial barrier. Both the WRM and the miniature humanoid figure were ecstatic to see this. The WM called out to the man with the Wang surname, and its body regressed to its former size as it swept up the man as a streak of green light before hurtling directly toward the massive ball of light. The man with the Wang surname took a cold glance at Han Li as he was being swept away. At this moment, Han Li was looking on with a blank expression, yet was doing nothing to save himself. The WM shot a glance at him as if he were appraising a dead man before letting loose a long roar and disappearing into the ball of light. It wasn't afraid of Han Li also attempting to escape through the same avenue. This ball of light contained the true essential power of both itself and the miniature humanoid figure, so no one could pass through it unless they were accompanied by one of them. The miniature humanoid figure also swept forth as a swath of golden light, sweeping up the fatso before also hurtling toward the ball of light. Right at this moment, a dull thunderclap suddenly erupted nearby, following which a winged humanoid figure appeared amid a burst of spatial fluctuations. The humanoid figure then rustled his sleeve, and a swath of grey light surged toward the golden light. The miniature humanoid figure felt a burst of suction force appear out of thin air. It was taken by surprise as another humanoid figure adhered himself to its body. "Seeing as you have a way out of here, I'm sure you won't mind taking me with you, right, Xianxia?" The owner of the voice was none other than Han Li. The miniature humanoid figure faltered slightly before turning its gaze toward the direction where Han Li had already been situated. There, he discovered another Han Li standing on the spot. The Han Li replica smiled at it before disappearing, transforming into a green talisman that disappeared in the blink of an eye. This was none other than the spirit form talisman that Han Li had been nurturing this entire time. Han Li had begun hatching a plot as soon as the two spatial tempering cultivators sprang into action to tear through the spatial barrier here. He manifested his spirit from talisman into his own form in order to act as a decoy while he snuck closer to the ball of light surreptitiously using his thunderstorm wings. Due to the fact that the spirit form talisman had been nurtured for several centuries and that it possessed certain properties of a tribulation avatar, the spatial tempering cultivators weren't able to identify that something was amiss about it, such was their hurry. Thus, Han Li took advantage of this opportunity, using his divine essence-fused light to adhere himself to the miniature humanoid figure like a plaster. "Do you want to die?" The miniature humanoid figure quickly recovered from its surprise and immediately realized what Han Li was trying to do. Thus, it faltered in midair before blasting forth countless streaks of golden light, all of which swept toward Han Li with devastating force. However, much to its surprise, the golden light was only able to make the grey light around Han Li's body tremor violently, but was unable to puncture through it nor dispel it. If your true body were here, then I naturally wouldn't be able to withstand your immense power. However, if you're just an avatar, then you won't be able to escape my divine essence-fused light in a short time. Do you really want to be stalled here by me, Xianxia?" Han Li chuckled from within the grey light. "You're threatening me." The miniature humanoid figure erupted into a thunderous rage, yet just as it was about to unleash another attack, a shrill shriek suddenly rang out from the air above. Upon hearing this ghastly cry, Han Li's body temperature rose drastically as all of his blood surged toward the surface of his skin. However, Han Li had already completely mastered the Vajra arts, so his skin possessed no less fortitude than a top-grade treasure. As such, He was able to alleviate his discomfort by activating this cultivation art. However, the miniature humanoid figure's expression changed drastically upon hearing this shriek. Even though the fatso was being protected by the golden light that it was radiating, his face still immediately turned bright red upon hearing this cry, and his body began to sway unsteadily. It's using the blood-weeping technique. The miniature humanoid figure hurriedly swiped a hand through the air, upon which a pillar of golden light erupted forth and injected itself into the fatso's body. Immediately thereafter, the fatso shuddered and his face returned to a more normal pallor. At this moment, a massive bone claw suddenly extended out of one of the twisted doors of light, trying to force it open again. The claw was as pristine white as jade and was emanating astonishing spiritual pressure. The ghastly shriek from earlier also appeared to have erupted from within that door of light. Han Li set aside the astonishment in his heart as he asked in a remarkably calm manner, "Looks like that jade-bone humanoid devil will emerge soon. If the senior that just escaped from this place destroys this passageway in order to prevent the devil from escaping, then we really will perish here. Are you not concerned about that, senior?" The miniature humanoid figure's expression had already darkened significantly at the sight of the massive bone claw, and its expression soured even further upon hearing this. Old Devil Ming really was cruel and decisive enough to be capable of something like this. At this moment, another bone claw found its way out of the door of light. The two claws were clamped on either side of the door of light, and the sharp shriek suddenly cut off, only to be replaced by a thunderous roar. It appeared that it was going to emerge at any moment. "You made the right gamble this time, brat. I'll take you out of this place." The miniature humanoid figure immediately agreed without any further hesitation. Han Li was ecstatic to hear this. The divine essence-fused light around the miniature humanoid figure was eased slightly, following which brilliant golden light suddenly erupted, enveloping most of the grey light before plunging into the massive ball of light with Han Li in tow. Han Li merely used his divine essence-fused light to protect himself and allowed the miniature humanoid figure to do whatever it was that it had to do. After entering the ball of light, Han Li felt as if he had arrived in a world of scintillating light. Immediately thereafter, he was struck by a rush of dizziness, following which he abruptly appeared in the air above the mountain. There was a massive ball of light hovering mid-air nearby. However, only half of it was visible while the other half was presumably still within the peculiar space from which they had just escaped. The green WRM and its disciple were situated not far away from here, and both of them were stunned to see that Han Li had also managed to escape. Han Li immediately spread open his thunderstorm wings and disappeared as an arc of azure and white lightning in the blink of an eye. In the next instant, he appeared several hundred feet away. For some reason, the miniature humanoid figure made no attempt to trap him and allowed him to easily open up some distance between them. The tiny green WM looked on with a cold expression, and a sinister light flashed through its eyes as it prepared to attack Han Li. However, right at this moment, a burst of harrowing spatial fluctuations suddenly erupted from within the massive semisphere of light. Immediately thereafter, the sound of a raging tsunami rang out as a section of the sky suddenly became crumpled like a paper ball. Crap! It's a spatial storm. Everyone present on the scene, including Han Li, were all thrown into a blind panic. None of them had time to address any other matters as they unleashed their respective movement techniques, transforming into streaks of light that all fled in different directions. Even though teleportation techniques were generally more effective, escaping into space within a spatial storm was nothing short of suicide. Thankfully, all of the beings present possessed powerful cultivation bases, and even though they were only using normal movement techniques, they still managed to cover a distance of several thousand feet after just a few flashes. A muffled thump erupted as countless thin black cracks began to appear on the crumpled patch of sky. These cracks then quickly elongated, making the entire space within a distance of over 1,000 feet riddled with cracks in the blink of an eye. The tsunami-like rumbling and roaring then intensified as these black cracks shattered, following which bursts of liquid-like white light began to ooze forth from within in a frenzy. A peculiar scene ensued. As soon as the white light appeared in this space, gale-force winds were swept up, drawing in everything in the nearby area. These winds were like all-engulfing monsters. Anything that was caught up in these gusts of wind were either instantly shredded or disappeared in the blink of an eye. Furthermore, thunderous ghastly cries were erupting from within the gusts of wind. At this point, Han Li was already situated on the summit of a small mountain close to 10 kilometers away, assessing the situation from afar in an expressionless manner. This spatial storm was clearly far inferior in power to the ones he'd encountered within the spatial node. Even so, Han Li definitely didn't want to be swept up in it. Back when he was in the spatial node, it really was all thanks to the Ice Phoenix's spatial abilities that they were able to traverse through the spatial storms. Even so, most of his treasures had been destroyed and he'd almost perished in there. Now, this spatial storm was only intensifying in ferocity, and it appeared that it wasn't going to be subsiding anytime soon. After further contemplating the situation for a while longer, Han Li suddenly flew toward his cave abode as a flash of azure light, leaving behind everyone else. Chapter 1350 Bone Hand. The green WM naturally sensed what Han Li was doing, and its brows furrowed as it suddenly asked its disciple a few questions. After hearing the answers to those questions, the green WM's expression darkened even further. Right at this moment, a swath of golden light skirted around from another direction, appearing beside the green WM after just a few flashes. The golden light then receded to reveal the fatso, as well as the miniature humanoid figure, who was hovering above his head in a calm manner. Brother Ming, are you really going to let that brat go? If he reports what we were doing here to the heavenly guards, it could prove to be slightly troublesome to us, the miniature humanoid figure asked. It's just as you say, the situation in that case would only be a little troublesome for us, so why would I go to so much effort just to rid myself of a minor inconvenience? Searching for treasures on the spirit land of others isn't a big deal anyway, and we were only keeping this a secret beforehand due to the resounding reputation of Master Thousand Treasure. Besides, we haven't even found any treasures, so what we did here matters even less. Unless there's a conflict of interest involved, I have no intention of making those ascended cultivators my enemy. Furthermore, I heard from my disciple that this brat is familiar with Zhao Wugui. Heavenly Guard Zhao himself isn't much to fear, but his master is Lei Luo the Enlightened from the panel of elders. If you don't want to let this brat escape, I'd be willing to lend you a hand, though, the green WM said in a cold voice. I have no vendetta against that brat, so why would I do that? Seeing as there are no treasures here, I'll be taking my leave now. I'll be sure to visit you in person when I have some spare time, the miniature humanoid figure replied with a sly chuckle. He then cupped his fist in a parting salute before transforming into a streak of golden light, sweeping up the fatso and disappearing into the distance without so much as a second glance at the spatial storm. That old bastard was clearly swindled by that brat and was forced to take him. Now, he's trying to coax me into killing that Han brat so he can use me as a weapon. Does he think I'm a naive child? HMPH. Let's go, my disciple. Seeing as a spatial storm has appeared here, the attention of Deep Heaven City's enforcement squad would definitely be drawn to this place. Even though they won't be able to get here so quickly from Deep Heaven City, it's not entirely impossible that there could just so happen to be heavenly guards nearby. It'll be quite troublesome if we were to bump into them. Not only did we not secure the treasures we're looking for this time, this avatar of mine has sustained some substantial damage. What a stroke of ill fortune. The green WM harumphed coldly after the streak of golden light disappeared into the distance. The WM's body then elongated before flying toward another direction as a streak of green light. His disciple hurriedly followed suit as a streak of blue light. After those two streaks of light also disappeared into the distance, there were no sounds to be heard in the surrounding area aside from the rumbling erupting from the spatial storm. At this moment, Han Li was situated within the hall of his cave abode, inspecting the silver screen of light before him with his arms crossed. After verifying that the two spatial tempering cultivators had indeed left his spirit land, he heaved a long sigh of relief. Now, there was only a massive yellow speck of light flashing erratically and incessantly on the silver screen. That speck of light is naturally none other than the spatial storm detected by the myriad dragon beads. Han Li's situation was different from those of old Devil Ming and the others. Those people could just leave without a second thought, but he had to stay and monitor this spatial storm in case it destroyed his plot of spirit land. Thankfully, he had accumulated extensive experience in such areas from his journey through the spatial node, so he knew that spatial storms of this nature generally wouldn't rage on for too long. As expected, After about 2 hours, the speck of yellow light on the light screen gradually began to dim. After another 15 minutes, it had completely disappeared. Han Li heaved a long sigh of relief upon seeing this. He then cast a final glance at the screen of light, yet just as he was about to deactivate this formation spell that expended a vast number of spirit stones, he suddenly caught sight of something, and his expression changed drastically. At the spot where the yellow speck of light had disappeared, a grey speck of light had replaced it. This speck of light was far smaller than the yellow one and appeared to be extremely feeble, as if it could fizzle out at any moment. However, as soon as the grey speck of light appeared, it immediately began to move toward a certain direction. Han Li was astonished to see this, and he couldn't just sit still and watch any longer. Could it be that a wisp of that devil's soul escaped from the spatial storm? Even though he wasn't sure just what this jade-bone humanoid devil was, the fact that even spatial tempering cultivators were scrambling to get away from it was a clear indication of just how fearsome it was. If it were still situated somewhere nearby, then there would be no end to his troubles. From the speck of grey light on the silver screen, Han Li could tell that the thing that had escaped possessed extremely feeble spiritual pressure, which indicated that it was severely injured. As such, it shouldn't be very difficult to kill. With that in mind, Han Li had arrived at a decision. He rose to his feet and left his cave abode as a streak of azure light, heading directly toward the location where the spatial storm had disappeared. Moments later, he had arrived in the air above where the spatial storm once was. As expected, the spatial storm had indeed disappeared. The small mountain had also disappeared along with it, leaving a massive crater over 1,000 feet in radius in its place. Han Li skirted around the crater for a couple of laps but didn't detect anything amiss. His brows furrowed as he stopped and hovered in midair before closing his eyes. He released his powerful spiritual sense, which was not inferior to that of a spatial tempering cultivator, to encompass the surrounding area in a radius of over 500 kilometers, carefully searching through every single inch of land. After just a short while, Han Li abruptly opened his eyes as a peculiar look appeared on his face. After a brief moment of contemplation, he let loose a long cry, upon which brilliant azure light erupted from his body. He then shot forth toward a certain direction as a streak of azure light. The azure streak of light only traveled for close to 200 kilometers before stopping in the air above a lush forest. The light receded to reveal Han Li standing in midair with his hands clasped behind his back. Blue light then flashed through his eyes as he cast his gaze downward. All of a sudden, he harumphed coldly before grabbing the air down below with one hand. An azure hand of light appeared beneath him, grabbing down toward a certain spot in the forest. The hand emitted bursts of ringing sounds, and even though it was only around 10 feet in size, it encompassed an area of over 100 feet down below, creating quite an intimidating sight to behold. A streak of grey light suddenly shot forth from the forest beneath the azure hand before fleeing toward another direction. Han Li seemed to have anticipated this, and he quickly raised his other hand to flick his 5 fingers toward the grey light. 5 red threads immediately flashed forth from his fingertips before disappearing into space. In the next instant, the red threads reappeared before rapidly binding themselves around the ball of green light. The grey light immediately began to swell and shrink erratically as if it were trying to break free. However, Han Li had already made a hand seal as scorching crimson flames erupted from the 5 fiery threads, completely engulfing the grey light. Anguished cries erupted from within the grey light, and it seemed to be very feeble as it was completely eradicated by the crimson flames, revealing a pristine white object. Han Li raised his eyebrows as he waved a hand downward expressionlessly. The flames on the surface of the object immediately receded, and it was forcibly drawn into Han Li's grasp. Han Li focused his gaze on the object to find that it was a white bony hand with golden runes faintly shimmering over its surface. He could tell from a single glance that this was one of the jade-bone humanoid devil's hands, but it was only at the size of a normal hand now. Han Li carefully inspected the bone hand with his spiritual sense and his bright sight spirit eyes, and the discoveries he made were quite astounding to him. His spiritual sense revealed to him that this object was a treasure, and quite a powerful one at that. Meanwhile, his spirit eyes informed him that this is indeed the skeleton of a human hand. This was a peculiar treasure that had been refined using human bones. The grey light that was adhered to the surface of the treasure was a hint of spiritual nature, but it had been easily eradicated by Han Li's fire spirit threads. As such, This treasure was now nothing more than an inanimate object. Most importantly, there was a white jade badge around an inch in size hidden within the thumb of this skeletal hand. There was silver light shimmering on the badge, and there were also many glimmering silver runes carved on its surface, all of which were in the beveled silver text. Han Li was able to quickly ascertain that this was one of the 72 outer pages of the Golden Jade Tome. Furthermore, it was a complete page, rather than a half page like the one already in Han Li's possession. Upon rough assessment, Han Li was able to decipher that this page seemed to include information regarding tool refinement. Even though Han Li appeared to be quite calm and collected, he was ecstatic that he had stumbled across such a treasure. However, now wasn't the time to carefully inspect the page of the Golden Jade Tome. Spiritual light flashed several times in quick succession within Han Li's hands as he plastered a few restriction talismans onto the skeletal hand. He then carefully placed it into a jade box before immediately departing from the scene, returning directly to his cave abode. Unbeknownst to Han Li, he had made an extremely wise decision in departing from that area so quickly. Not only after he had snuck back into his cave abode, a formation suddenly appeared out of thin air above the spot where the spatial storm had once raged. Brilliant white light flashed as a shimmering golden ark emerged. The ark was carrying 2 golden-armored heavenly guards, one with bushy brows and a cloth crown on his head, while the other was quite slender with a pair of thin, delicate brows. They were, respectively, a middle-aged man and a beautiful female cultivator. This is definitely the location that showed up on the all-encompassing disk. From the looks of the residual spatial fluctuations, the spatial storm appeared to have been quite a small-scale one and could have just been the result of a rare natural phenomenon. It did indeed appear to be a rather small and relatively harmless spatial storm, and it seemed to have only lasted a short time. Otherwise, it would have done more than just raze that small mountain to the ground. The male cultivator nodded in response while examining everything in the surrounding area with his spiritual sense.